Welcome to the debate. So picture a massive landscape. We are talking searing heat and just a crushing, endless river of millions of people walking for miles.
The sheer scale of it really just defies logic, honestly.
It absolutely does. Yet, right in the middle of this total chaos, there is a thin young boy. He is tightly gripping his father's hand, and he looks up at a crowd that stretches entirely beyond the horizon. And he asks a remarkably simple question. He asks, why do we walk?
And that singular question is, well, it's really the axis this entire massive phenomenon spins on. Because the father, interestingly enough, he doesn't just hand him an answer.
No, he just smiles.
Right, he stays quiet at first, because he knows the answer isn't a sentence you can just, memorize. It is an entire journey. Exactly. And that brings us to the core of our discussion today, drawing directly from our source material on the mechanics of massive human rituals, specifically the Arbaeen pilgrimage. We want to look at how profound meaning actually survives across generations, which is a huge question.
Right. So what is the true engine of a ritual of this unimaginable magnitude? Does its enduring power stem primarily from the structured, collective transmission of values, what we might call deliberate parental duty, and the forging of a collective social identity? Or is it ultimately rooted in the individual's pure internal experience, that pristine childhood wonder and individual spiritual awakening?
It's the ultimate tension, really, between the gravity of the crowd and the flight of the individual's soul.
It is, and in today's debate, I will be arguing that the true power of these enduring rituals lies in deliberate parental duty and the rigorous transition of personal faith into a collective social identity.
The ritual survives centuries because it is actively, purposefully engineered and inherited by the community.
And I will be arguing that the collective, the millions of people, the shared food, the miles walked, that is merely a backdrop. It is a stage setting for individual spiritual growth. The ritual's survival actually depends entirely on the pure, personal wonder and internal transformation of the individual. Without that unmediated inner light, the crowd is just a crowd.
Well, let's look closely at how the material sets this up, because it fundamentally outlines a deliberate, architectural transition from personal faith to collective social identity. The text provides a very precise sociological ladder.
Okay, break that down for us. Sure. It says worship becomes a symbol, and the symbol becomes a ritual or a sha'ira. Let's look at what a sha'ira actually means in this context. It's not just a habit, like brushing your teeth.
Right.
It's taking a deeply held, invisible value, like justice or truth, and turning it into an undeniable physical action that a community repeats so they never forget it. It is meaning, memory, and ultimately identity.
But you can't just mandate identity.
No, you can't mandate it, but you do have to transfer it. The father's role in this story represents what the text calls the functional transfer of meaning. Think of it like teaching a kid to ride a bike.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just hand them a manual on the physics of balance. You have to take them outside, hold the seat, run alongside them, and let them feel the road. Values like honesty and loyalty die if they remain only in books or speeches.
They have to be lived.
Exactly. They must be practiced. They are passed down through duty, sacrifice, and visible daily behavior. The ritual survives because parents purposefully and actively guide the next generation into a collective story that is vastly larger than themselves.
I come at it from a different way. The narrative we are examining centers entirely on the child's perspective, which to me proves that individual spiritual growth is the ultimate engine of this ritual.
How so?
Well, consider the boy himself. He lacks historical knowledge. He lacks worldly experience. He certainly has no grasp of the complex sociology you just mentioned. I mean, he doesn't know what a shayera is.
No, of course not.
Yet his pure wonder allows him to feel a profound sense of safety despite the blistering heat and the overwhelming, physically crushing crowds.
But that safety is provided by the crowd.
I completely disagree with that reading. I think you're giving the collective way too much credit here. The boy feels safe despite the crushing crowd, not because of it. When he asks, "Why do we walk?" the father's initial smile and silence speak volumes.
Because it's a difficult question.
Because the meaning isn't handed down like a book from a shelf. It must be individually discovered. The materialist explicitly concludes by showing us that the ritual exists and endures not because it is practiced by the masses, but because it changes the individual inside out. The engine is entirely internal.
If the engine is entirely internal, then let's test that by looking at how the material describes the very origin of a ritual. The text gives us a beautiful isolated example. A man praying alone in a small room.
Right. Performing his 2 units of prayer.
Exactly. No one sees him, no one hears him. Now that act is pure obedience, yes. It is deeply personal. But the material is explicit here. The ritual is only born when that man steps out of his room and into a long line, making his individual act part of a vastly larger scene.
Right. But the private act has to come first.
It comes first, yes, but it doesn't survive time on its own. It's the same with the material's example of distributing food. Individuals might secretly or openly give food to the poor, and that private intent is noble.
Very noble.
But they only create a collective message when they unite into a single, massive campaign. You say the individual intent is everything, but intent without action is invisible. How does a child actually see intent unless millions of people coordinate to physically show it?
I see where you're going with this.
That's where the collective structure becomes mandatory. The collective identity is what elevates the action into a historical force.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You have to focus on the exact phrasing in the material regarding that solitary man praying in his room.
Okay.
It says, "It did not beget from the group, but from the individual." The ritual only has power because of the pure, individual intent that precedes it in that quiet room.
But if it stays in the room,
Let me finish this thought. If you have a long line of people who do not have that internal individual purity, if they haven't experienced those solitary 2 units of prayer in their own private hearts, the collective line is completely empty. It's a theater set with no actors.
a theater set with no actors?
Exactly. The collective message of distributing food doesn't spontaneously generate from the crowd. It is an aggregation of individual spiritual awakenings. You can't mass produce a spiritual awakening just by putting people in a line. The crowd is just the math. The individual is the meaning.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective using the analogy provided right there in the text. The material compares this massive pilgrimage to a football match.
Oh, right. The stadium analogy?
Yeah. You can have 50,000 people gather in a stadium for a game. That is a massive aggregation of individuals with personal intent. They all chose to be there. They are all wearing the same colors. They are cheering in unison.
Sure.
What happens? It all dissipates the second the final whistle blows. Everyone goes home and the phenomenon vanishes into thin air. Conversely, 1,000 people taking a moral stand leaves an impact for a century.
Because the moral stand is internal.
No, because of the mechanism of what is being shared. Why does the sports crowd dissipate while the pilgrimage endures? Because the football fans are passive consumers of entertainment. A ritual of this magnitude demands shared moral sacrifice.
But the individual makes the sacrifice.
The difference between the ephemeral football crowd and the enduring pilgrimage isn't just that the pilgrims have individual wonder. It is the collective, structured commitment to specific shared values. We are talking about loyalty to truth, resisting oppression and arrogance, the realization that a human is not measured by what they possess, but by what they give.
Right.
When you sacrifice together, you forge a collective social identity that outlives any single person. You need the massive collective structure to bind those values into a historical force that can't be ignored.
But if the collective structure is so vital, how does that historical force actually take root in a new generation? This brings us to the method of transmission. You frame it as a structured commitment, an engineered inheritance.
Yes.
But look at the child holding his father's hand. Does that boy comprehend resisting oppression and arrogance in a structural socio-political sense? Of course not. He understands something deeply experiential and profoundly private.
But that experiential understanding is carefully curated by the older generation. It doesn't just fall out of the sky.
Curated? Maybe, but
The text explicitly outlines this as the 4th stage of the ritual, the stage of inheritance. And it states that meaning is not transferred like moving an object from one place to another. It is transferred through blood, through sacrifice, through altruism, and through role models.
Right, role models.
Think back to the narrative. The father eventually does stop the boy in the middle of the crowded road, beneath the raising banners. And he gives him a highly structured explanation.
He does give an explanation, yes.
A sociological one. He tells him, we don't walk because the road is long or because history demands it. We walk because a word started in a heart, became a ritual, became a phenomenon, became a memory, and finally became an immortal identity.
Yeah, he says that.
He even quotes the Quran, referencing the people of understanding. That is direct, deliberate parental duty. The father is constructing the boy's social identity right there on the road. He is actively passing the baton.
That's a compelling argument, but if you consider that the boy's true understanding actually completely surpasses the father's words.
How could it surpass it? He's a child.
Because right after the father gives that beautiful structured speech about phenomena and immortal identities, the material notes something absolutely crucial. It says that in that moment the boy understood something he couldn't even explain. He didn't process his father's speech as a sociological thesis.
But the speech gave him the framework to feel it.
I would argue the speech was just background noise to the actual event occurring inside the child. He realized, in a flash of unmediated internal light, that the physical road wasn't the point. The distributed food wasn't the point. Even the massive crowds weren't the point. The internal realization, the value walking within the hearts, the light walking within the human, wherever they go is what actually matters.
That's a very poetic way of looking at it.
It's like trying to explain the taste of an orange to someone who has never eaten one. The father provided the words, he described the chemistry of the fruit, but the boy's pristine, unmediated wonder is what allowed him to actually bite into it and taste the meaning. The transmission wasn't intellectual, it was a spiritual resonance that the collective structure could only vaguely point toward, but never actually deliver itself.
I completely agree that the boy tastes the orange, to use your metaphor, but without the father deliberately planting the tree, tending the orchard, harvesting the fruit, and literally handing it to the child, the boy starves.
The spiritual resonance doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the ultimate goal of that spiritual resonance? If it just stays inside the boy, isolated in his own pristine wonder, then the ritual dies with him.
It doesn't die with him because it transforms him.
But transformation has a purpose. The material argues that the ultimate success of this ritual is its ability to reproduce itself annually across generations until ultimate justice is achieved. It's about ensuring that the values of heaven don't fade into mere theory.
Okay, but
The text points out that honesty doesn't live in speeches, it lives in trustworthiness during buying and selling. Justice doesn't live in books, it lives in the stances people take in the real world when the price is terribly high. The collective social identity is the mechanism that ensures these values remain practiced. Without the parental duty to mold the child into this collective organism, the ritual is reduced to a fleeting personal feeling.
When I first read the mother's question at the end of the text, when the boy returns home and she asks, "What did you take from the road?" I originally thought the boy's answer was just poetic.
Right, he says, I took nothing.
Yeah, he says, "I took nothing. The road took something from me and left something in me." But when you look closely at the evidence of what actually happens when the pilgrimage ends, the ultimate transformation is focused entirely on the individual soul, independent of the crowd.
How is it independent of the crowd when he just walked with millions of people?
Because look at the ultimate product of the journey. He returns smiling more. He gets angry less. He serves people without expecting thanks. The material deliberately concludes by stating that the ritual remains because it creates a new human.
A new human.
Right. It doesn't say it remains because it creates a new society or a stronger crowd or a better political structure. It says a new human. The massive crowds, the banners, the shared food, all of that is merely a crucible. It is a tool designed for one singular purpose: the spiritual elevation of the single individual. The individual's internal transformation is the actual masterpiece.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently, because look at the very traits the boy brings back. You just listed them yourself. he gets angry less, he serves people without expecting thanks. Those are inherently, fundamentally social traits.
They are personal virtues.
They are personal virtues that only matter in relation to other people. His individual growth doesn't isolate him on a mountaintop of personal enlightenment. It immediately feeds back into the collective duty of the community. He becomes a better, more calibrated node in the social network.
A node?
Yes, a node. The new human the text refers to is a human who is now perfectly suited to uphold the collective identity. The internal transformation you are praising is exactly the functional transfer of meaning that the father was aiming for all along. The boy will grow up, he will have his own child, he will hold his hand on that same blistering road, and he will perform his parental duty, continuing the cycle. The individual change is beautiful, yes, but it is just the fuel for the collective engine.
But if you reduce the individual spiritual transformation to mere fuel for a collective engine, you lose the profound poetry and the underlying truth of the text. Why does the boy feel safety in a dangerous, hot, crushing crowd?
Because his father is there.
Because his individual soul is tuning into a frequency, connecting to the divine meaning behind the ritual before he even has the vocabulary to express it. If it were purely about social conditioning and collective identity, the child would just be mimicking behaviors.
Children do mimic behaviors. That's the first step of learning.
But the text goes out of its way to show us he isn't just mimicking. It emphasizes his simple clothes, his thin body, and his mind that is ready to receive truths that millions of adult men and women cannot even carry. That vulnerability, that pure childhood wonder, is the required state for the ritual to actually take hold.
Inner light, the purely personal encounter with the value itself.
I don't disagree that the inner light is vital, but the text explicitly corrects those who say we do this just because our fathers did it. It says they aren't just blindly transferring the physical act. They are transferring the value behind the act.
Right.
And that transfer requires immense, undeniable structure. It requires the visible scale of millions of people acting in unison. When a child sees an entire society subordinating itself to a higher moral standard, serving food for free, walking in the searing heat, displaying radical, lived egalitarianism, that is what sparks the wonder. The wonder doesn't just spontaneously generate in a vacuum. It is deeply mediated by the collective environment the parents and the community have painstakingly built.
Mediated, perhaps, but certainly not generated by it. The spark itself is profoundly private. Let me remind you of the specific phrase in the material. It says, "The ritual is not an act, it is meaning. It is not a repetition, it is memory."
Yes, memory.
Memory, in its most profound spiritual sense, is experienced entirely alone in the quiet architecture of one's own heart, even when you are surrounded by millions of people. When the mother asks, "What did you take from the road?" she isn't asking about his civic duty. She is asking about his internal landscape.
And his answer proves my point exactly. The road took something from me and left something in me. The road, meaning the collective journey, the shared sacrifice, the massive social phenomenon, that is the active agent in that sentence. It did the taking and the leaving.
But what it left was a fundamentally changed individual soul. A soul that understands the truth without needing to articulate it sociologically. The word of truth was completed in him individually long before he ever becomes a father himself.
This is a fascinating tension, and I think it perfectly sets up where we find ourselves as we bring this debate to a close. To summarize my position, when we look at the mechanics of this massive human phenomenon, we see that rituals endure because of a rigorous, deliberate transition from personal faith to collective social identity. It is the parental duty, beautifully modeled by the father holding his son's hand, to transfer this meaning through daily life, shared sacrifice, and visible action. If values like truth and justice are not practiced collectively, if they are just private feelings, they die. The ritual survives because it constructs an immortal identity that binds millions together across generations, ensuring the meaning remains a living, breathing force in the real world.
And my position remains that without the pristine, individual wonder of the child, that collective ritual would completely lose its soul. The massive crowds, the inherited duties, the structured speeches from the parents, they would all just be an empty shell. A theater set without actors.
Right.
The boy walks without preconceptions and allows the journey to rewrite his internal landscape. The true anchor of the ritual is that unmediated, personal, spiritual growth. The millions of people are ultimately there in service of creating just one transformed, elevated human being at a time. The ritual remains because it changes the individual from the inside out.
It is a remarkable piece of source material, precisely because it refuses to let us choose just one easily. It beautifully suspends these two ideas in perfect tension. On one side, you have a father dutifully, purposefully passing down an ancient structured truth. And on the other, you have a child experiencing it with completely new, world-altering wonder. Analyzing this deep interplay between the immense, roaring crowd and the solitary, quiet individual offers us profound insights into how human values actually survive time itself.
It really does. It leaves us to look at that staggering, endless river of millions of people walking in the heat and realize that the entire weight of that history might just be resting entirely on the shoulders of one thin boy, feeling a sense of safety he can't even name.
Small. We will leave it to our listeners to decide which force, the duty of the collective or the wonder of the individual, is the true anchor of the ritual. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, keep questioning the lines between the crowd and the soul.